Chapter 5. Simon Dar had taken it as a thing that was as it should be, when his father had agreed with Lavransdatter on his match with Lavransdatter. In his kindred it had ever been the custom that all such matters were in the parents' hands. He had been glad when he saw that his bride was so fair and gracious. He had indeed never looked for anything else than that he should be good friends with the wife his father chose for him. Kristin and he suited each other well in age and birth and fortune. If Lavrans were of a somewhat higher kin, his father, on his side, was a knight, and had been much about King Hakon, while the other had always lived retired on his estates. And Simon had never remarked anything else other than that wedded folk agreed well together when they were an equal match. Then came that night in the loft at Finnsbrecken, when evil tongues would have undone the innocent young child. From that hour he had known well enough that his betrothed was dearer to him than if he had but loved her as in duty bound. He thought not much on the matter, but he was glad. He saw that the maid was bashful and coy, but he thought not much on that either. Then came the time in Oslo, when he was forced to think things over, and then the evening in Fluger's loft. He had come up against something here that he had not thought could happen in this world, amongst honourable folk of a good kindred, and in these times. Blinded and stunned, he had flung himself free of his ties, though in bearing he had been cool and calm and steady in talking of the matter with his father and hers. Thus had he departed from the customs of his house. And next he had done another thing unheard of in his kindred. Without even taking counsel with his father, he had wooed the rich young widow at Mandvik. He was dazzled when he saw that Lady Halfrid liked him. She was much more rich and high-born than Kristin, being son's daughter to Baron Thor Hakonsson of Tunsberg, and widow of Sir Finn Aslaksen, and she was comely, and had so fine and noble a bearing that, compared with her, all the women he was used to seemed to him but as farmers' wives. In the devil's name he would show them all that he could win the noblest wife. In riches and everything else she bore the bell from this Tronda that Kristin had let herself be smirched by, and a widow. That too was good, plain and above board. The devil might trust in maids any more for him. He had been made to learn 'twas not such a plain, straightforward thing to live in the world, as he had thought it when at home at Differen. There his father had ruled all things, and his judgments were right. True, Simon had been with the bodyguard and served as page for a time, and he had gained a little learning from his father's house-priest at home. It might chance now and again that he thought his father's wisdom a little behind the time. He would venture to gainsay him too, now and then, but it was but as a joke, and it was taken as a joke. "A quick-witted lad, Simon," laughed his father and mother, and so said his brothers and sisters, who would never gainsay Sir Andres. But all things were done as his father willed. Simon himself thought this was but right. In the years when he was wedded to Halfrid Erlingsdatter and dwelt at Mandvik, he learnt each day more thoroughly that life might be more cross-grained and crooked than Sir Andres Gudmundsson had ever dreamt. That he should not be able to be happy with such a wife as he had won, such a thought could never have come to him. Deep down in his mind lurked a rueful wonder when he looked at his wife as she moved about the house all day long. So comely was she, with her gentle eyes and the mouth that was so sweet when the lips were shut. No woman he had ever seen could wear her robes and her adornments with so much grace. And in the black darkness of the night, distaste for her wore all youth and freshness out of him. She was sickly, her breath unhealthful, her caresses tortured him. She was so good that it filled him with a desperate shame, but he could not overcome his misliking. And then 'twas not long after they were wed, before he saw that she could never bear him a living, healthful child. He saw that she sorrowed over it herself even more than he. It cut him to the heart when he thought of her fate in that matter. One thing and another he had heard. 'Twas so with her because Sir Finn had struck and kicked her more than once while she was wed with him, so that she had miscarried. He had been mad with jealousy of his young fair lady. Her kinsman would have taken her from him, but Halfred thought that it behoved a Christian wife to cleave to her wedded husband, were he good or evil. But if he could not have children of her, then must he ever feel, as now he did, that it was her lands they dwelt on, her riches that he dealt with and controlled. He dealt with them heedfully and wisely. But all through these years there grew up in his mind a longing for Formo, the manor that was Sir Andrew's mother's heritage, which it had always been meant he should take over after his father. He came at last to think that his home was away yonder north in Gudbrandsdal, almost more than in Romerick. Folks still went on calling his wife Lady Halfred, as in the time of her first husband, the knight. And this made Simon feel all the more as if he were but her steward at Mandvik. It chanced one day that they sat alone in the hall, Simon and his wife. One of the serving women had come into the hall on some errand. Halfred looked after her as she left. I wonder," said she. "I think that Joran is with child this summer." Simon sat with a bow in his lap, mending its lock. He changed the tap bolt, gazed down into the spring box, and said, without looking up, "Aye, and the child is mine." His wife was silent. When at last he looked up at her, she sat sewing, as intent on her work as he had been on his. Simon was sick at heart, sickened because he had so affronted his wife, and sickened at his folly in having to do with the girl, and vexed that he had taken the fatherhood on his shoulders. He was in no wise sure himself. Joran was a light piece of goods, he knew. In truth, he had never much liked her. She was ugly, but had a sharp tongue in her head, and was merry to talk with. And it had been she who sat up for him ever when he had come home late during the last winter. He had answered over hastily, fearing that his wife might complain and blame him. 'Twas a clownish fear. He should have known Halfred would never stoop to such complaints. But now 'twas done. Go back from his own word he would not. He must even put up with being held for the father of his serving woman's child, whether he were so or not. Halfred didn't speak again of the matter till a year after. Then, one day, she asked if he knew that Joran was to be wed over at Borg. Simon knew it well enough, for he had given her dowry himself. "Where was the child to be?" asked his wife. "With its mother's parents, where it was now," answered Simon. Then said she, "Methinks it would be more seemly that your daughter should grow up here on your manor." "In your manor, do you mean?" asked Simon. A little tremor passed over the lady's face. "You know well, my husband, that as long as we both live, you are master here at Mandvik," she said. Simon went and laid his hands on his wife's shoulders. "If indeed, Halfred, you think you can bear to see the child here in our home, great thanks shall I owe you for your high-heartedness." He didn't like it. He had seen the young one more than once. 'Twas not a comely child, and he could not see that it favoured him or any of his folks. Less than ever did he believe that he was the father. And he had been sorely angered when he heard that Joran had had the child christened Ungjerd after his mother, without asking leave of him. But he must let Halfrid have her way. She fetched the child to Mandvik, found a foster mother for it, and saw to it herself that the little one lacked for nothing. If her eyes chanced to fall upon the child, she often took it on her lap and tended it kindly and lovingly. And little by little, as Simon saw more of it, he grew fond of the little maid. He had a great love of children. Now, too, he thought he could see a likeness in Ungjerd to his father. It was like that Joran had been wise enough to be on her good behaviour after the master had gone too far with her. So it might well be that Ungjerd was his daughter, and what he had done at Halfrid's asking was the best and most honourable way. When they had been 5 years wedded, Halfrid bore her husband a son, a full-formed man-child. She was transfigured with joy, but after her delivery she fell so sick that it was soon plain to all that she must die. Yet she was of good cheer, the last time when for a while she was herself. Now shall you live on here as master, Simon, and hand on Mandvik and all our lands to your children and mine, she said to her husband. After this the fever mounted so high that she knew no more, and she had not the grief, while yet on earth, of hearing that her boy had died a day before his mother. And in the other home, Simon thought, 'twas most like she felt no sorrow for such things, but was glad that she had their Erling with her. Simon remembered afterward that the night the two bodies lay up in the loft room, he had stood leaning over the fence of a field that lay down by the seashore. It was just before St. John's Mass, and the night was so bright that the full moon's light was well nigh blotted out. The water lay there palely shining, and plashed and gurgled a little on the strand. Simon had hardly slept more than an hour at a time, ever since the night the boy had been born. It seemed to him now very long ago, and he was so weary that he could scarce feel grief. He was 27 years old at this time. Well on in the summer, when the estate was settled, Simon made over Mandvik to Stig Håkonsson, Halfrid's uncle's son. He moved to Differen and stayed there the winter. Old Sir Andres was bedridden with dropsy and many other ills and aches. He was nearing his end now, and he bemoaned him much. Life had not been so plain and simple for him either in these latter days. Things had not gone so with his fair and likely children as he had wished and looked that they should. Simon sat by his father and tried hard to get back to the easy jesting note of old, but the old man bemoaned himself without cease. Helga Saxdatter, whom Gerd had wedded, was so fine that she knew not what follies she should hit upon next. Gerd dared not belch in his own house without asking his wife's leave. And this Torgrim, ever and always in a pother about his belly. Never should Torgrim have had daughter of his, had he known that the man was such a poor wretch he could neither live nor die. Astrid could have no joy of her youth or her wealth so long as her husband lived. And here was Sigrid, broken and grieving. Smiles and song had quite gone out of her, his good child. That she should have had that child, and Simon no children. Sir Andres wept, an old, unhappy, sick man. Gudmund had set himself against every match his father had spoken of for him, and he was so old and useless now he had let the lad run wild altogether. But all the ill fortune had begun when Simon and that maid from the Dale set themselves up against their parents. And 'twas Lavran's blame. For, bold a man as he was among men, he was chicken-hearted with his womenkind. The girl had snivelled and screeched, no doubt, and straightway he gave in and sent for that gilded whoremonger from Trondheim that could not so much as wait till he had been given his bride in wedlock. But if Lavrans had but been master in his own house, he, Andrasdar, would soon have shown that he could put sense in the head of a beardless whelp of a son. Kristin Lavransdatter, she bore children aplenty, a strapping son every 11th month, he had heard. "Aye, but that comes dear, father," said Simon, laughing. "The heritage comes to be split up, sadly." He took Arngerd up and set her on his lap. She had just come trotting into the room. "Aye, 'twill not be through her that your heritage will be split up too small. Whoever else it be that shall divide it," said Sir Andres testily. He was fond of his grandchild in a fashion, but it angered him that Simon had a base-born child. "Have you thought upon any new match, Simon?" "Nay, you must let Halfred grow cold in her grave first, father," said Simon, stroking the child's pale hair. "I shall wed again in good time, but sure there is no such haste." He took his bow and his ski and set forth for the woods, where he could breathe more freely. With his dogs he tracked the elk on the snow crust, and he shot the capercailzie drowsing in the tree-tops. At night he slept in the different forest sæter, and felt that 'twas good to be alone. There was a scraping of ski outside on the hard snow. His dogs flew up barking, and other dogs answered from outside. Simon opened the door upon a night blue with moonlight, and his elder brother Gerd came in, tall and slender, and comely and quiet. He looked younger now than Simon, who had ever been somewhat stout and had grown a deal heavier in his years at Mandvik. The brothers sat with the food wallet between them, eating and drinking and gazing into the hearth fire. "You must have seen," said Gerd, "that Torgrim means to set us all by the ears when father is gone, and he has gotten Gudmund on his side, and Helga. They would fain keep Sigrid out of her full sister's share." "I have seen it. Her full share she shall have. You and I, brother, can sure make that good in despite of them. The best, perhaps, would be that father should take order in this before he dies," said Gerd. "No, let father die in peace," said Simon. "You and I between us should be able to guard our sister and see that they strip her not because she has fallen into such mischance." Thus it came about that on Sir Andrasdar's death his heirs parted in bitter unkindness. Gerd was the only one to whom Simon said farewell when he set out from home. And he knew that the life Gerd's wife was leading him in these days was a none too happy one. Sigrid he took with him to Formo. She was to manage his house, and he to see to her lands and goods. He rode into his manor on a grey-blue day of melting snows, when the alder thickets by the Lagan were brown with blossom. When he had alighted and was entering the hall, with Arngerd on his arm, Sigrid Andrasdatter asked, "Why did you smile, Simon?" "Smiled?" He had been thinking how far unlike was this homecoming to what he had once looked for, when the day came when he should take up his abode here on the manor of his father's mother's kin. A sister dishonoured, and a bastard child, these were his belongings now. The first summer he saw but little of the Jorungard folks. He took much pains to shun them. But the Sunday after the second Mary's Mass in the autumn, it chanced that he stood by Lavrans Bjorgulfsson's side in the church, so that 'twas they too that had to give each other the kiss of peace, when Sire Eirik had prayed that the peace of Holy Church might be increased in us. And when he felt the elder man's thin, dry lips against his cheek, and heard him murmur the prayer for peace upon him, he was strangely moved. He saw that Lavrans meant more by it than just to follow a usage of the church. He hastened out when the Mass was over. But at the standing for the horses he came on Lavrans, who prayed him to come with him to Jorungard and dine. Simon answered that his daughter was sick and his sister sitting by her. Lavrans then prayed that God might heal the child and shook hands for farewell. One evening, some days after, they had been hard at work at Formo getting in the harvest, for the weather looked doubtful. The most of the corn was housed by the evening when the first shower came down. Simon ran across the courtyard in pouring rain, while a stream of yellow sunlight from between the clouds shone on the hall house and the mountain wall behind it. And there he was ware of a little maid standing at the door in sun and rain. She had his favourite dog with her. It broke loose and leaped upon the man, dragging after it a woman's woven belt tied to its collar. He saw that the girl was the child of a good house. She was cloakless and bareheaded, but her wine-red frock was of city-bought cloth, broidered and made fast on the breast with a silver gilt brooch. A silk cord held back the ringleted hair, now dark with the wet, from her forehead. She had a lively little face, with broad forehead and pointed chin and great shining eyes, and her cheeks were flaming red, as though she had been running hard. Simon saw who the maid must be, and greeted her by name, Ramborg. "How comes it that you do me so much honour as to come hither to us?" he asked. "'Twas the dog," she said, as she went with him into the house out of the rain. It had a trick of running off to Jorungard. Now had she brought it back. Aye, she knew it was his dog. She had seen it running after him as he rode by. Simon rebuked her a little for having come hither on foot, quite alone. He said he would have horses saddled and take her home himself. But first, to be sure, she must have some food. Ramborg ran across at once to the bed where little Arngjerd lay ailing, and both the child and Sigrid were much pleased with the guest, for Ramborg was quick and lively. She was not like her sisters, Simon thought. He rode with Ramborg as far as the by-road to the manor, and would then have turned about, but there he met Lavrans, who had just learned that the child was not with her playmates at Lagerbro, and was setting forth with his people to search. He was much alarmed. Simon was made to come in, and when he had once taken his seat up in the hall, his shyness fell from him, and he felt quickly at home again with Ranfried and Lavrans. They sat late over their drink, and as the foul weather had now set in, he was thankful to stay the night. There were 2 beds in the hall. Ranfried made up one of them fairly for the guest, and now someone asked where Ramborg was to sleep, with her parents or in another house. "Nay, for I will be in my own bed," said the child. "Can I not sleep with you, Simon?" she begged. Her father said that the guest must not be plagued with children in his bed. But Ramborg went on clamouring that she would sleep along with Simon. At last Lavrans said sternly that she was too old to share a bed with a strange man. "No, father, that I am not," she said stubbornly. "I am not too big, am I, Simon?" "You are too little," said Simon, laughing. "Ask me in 5 years, Ramborg, and be sure I shall not say you nay. But I warrant then that you will have another sort of man, little Ramborg, than a fat and ugly old widower." It seemed that Lavrans liked not the jest. He told the girl sharply to hold her tongue and go lie down in her parents' bed. But Ramborg cried out once more. "Now you have asked for me, Simon Dar, and in my father's hearing." So I have indeed," answered Simon, laughing. "But I think, Ramborg, he will answer no." After this day the Jorungard folks and those of Formo were much together. Ramborg was over at the neighbour manor whenever a chance served. She played with Arngjerd as if the child had been her doll, ran about with Sigrid, helping in the housekeeping, and would sit in Simon's lap when they were in the hall. He fell again into the habit of petting and romping with the maid, as he had been used to do in old days, when she and Ulvhild had been as little sisters to him. Simon had dwelt 2 years in the Dale, when Geirmund Hersteinsen of Kruk made suit for Sigrid Undset. The Kruk kindred were of old yeoman stock, but though one and another of the men had served the kings in the bodyguard, they had never won any name beyond their own countryside. Yet it was as good a match as Sigrid could look to make, and she herself was willing to be wed with Geirmund. So her brother closed the bargain, and Simon held his sister's wedding at his house. One evening just before, while the hurry and bustle of making ready for the feast were at their worst, Simon said in jest that he knew not what would become of his house when Sigrid had left him. Then Ramborg said, "You must do the best you can for 2 years, Simon. At 14 years a maid is fit to wed, and then you can bring me home." "Nay, you I will not have," said Simon, laughing. "I dare not undertake to bridle so wild a maid as you." "'Tis the stillest tarns that run the deepest," says my father, Ramborg cried. "I am the wild kind. I. My sister, she was meek and mild. Have you forgotten Kristin now, Simon Anderson?" Simon leapt up from the bench, lifted the maid up against his breast, and kissed her throat so hard that the skin was flecked with red. Aghast and amazed at himself, he loosed her, caught up Angjerd, and threw her up and crushed her to him in the same way to hide his disorder. He went on romping with the two, the little and the half-grown maid, and chasing them about, while they fled from him up on tables and benches. At last he set them up on the crossbeam next the door and ran out. Kristin's name was scarce ever named at Jorungard in his hearing. Ramborg Lavransdatter grew comely as she grew in years. The talk of the countryside grew busy, making matches for her. At one time it was Eindrid Håkonsson of the Valdres Gieslings. They were kin in the 4th degree, but Lavrans and Håkon were both so rich they could well afford to send letters to the Pope in Baland and get dispensation. The match would put an end to some of the old suits at law that had been going on ever since the old Gieslings went out with Duke Skule and King Håkon took the Varg lands from them and gave them to Sigurd Eldjarn. Ivar Giesling the Young had won back Sundbu by weddings and exchanges, but these matters had led to endless jars and dissensions. Lavrans laughed at it all himself. The part of the spoil he could claim in his wife's right was not worth the calfskin and wax he had used up in the suit, to say nothing of the trouble and the journeys. But seeing he had been in the broil ever since he was a wedded man, he must hold out to the end. But Eindrid Giesling took another maid to wife, and the Jorungard folk seemed not overmuch cast down. They were at the bride ale, and Ramborg told her friends proudly, when she came home, that 4 men had come forward to sound Lavrans about her, either for themselves or for kinsmen. Lavrans had answered that he would not make any bargain for his daughter's hand till she was old enough to say a word in the matter herself. So things went on till the spring of the year when Ramborg was 14 winters old. One evening that spring she was in the byre at Formo with Simon, looking at a calf that had been born. It was white with a brown patch, and the patch seemed to Ramborg to be the very shape of a church. Simon sat on the edge of the corn bin while the girl leaned across his knees and he pulled at her plaits. "Then I wager 'tis a token that you will soon ride to church, a bride, Ramborg." "Aye, you know well enough my father will not answer no the day you ask for me," she said. "I am so grown up now, I might well wed this year." Simon was a little taken aback, but he tried to laugh. "Are you there again with that foolish old jest?" "You know well 'tis no jest," said the girl, looking up at him with her great eyes. "I have known it long, that 'tis to you, here at Formo, I would most fain come. Why have you kissed me, and set me in your lap many a time and often, if you would not have me?" Right fain would I be to have you, my Ramborg, but I had never thought that so fair and young a maid could be meant for me. I am 17 years older than you. You have not thought, I think, how you would like to have an old, blear-eyed, big-bellied husband when you were a woman in your best years." "These are my best years," said she, beaming, "and not yet are you so old and tottering, Simon." "But I am ugly. Soon you would be sick of kissing me." "That you have no cause to believe," she answered, laughing as before, and held up her mouth to be kissed. But he did not kiss her. "I will not profit by your simpleness, my sweet. Lavrans will take you with him to the south this summer. Should you not have changed your thoughts before you come back, then will I thank God and Our Lady for better fortune than I had looked for. But bind you I will not, fair Ramborg." He called his dogs, took his spear and bow, and went up on the hills that same evening. There was much snow on the uplands still. He struck off to his satyr and got him a pair of ski, then lay out for a week by the tarn south of the Boar Fells and hunted reindeer. But the evening he set off down towards home, he grew uneasy and fearful again. 'Twould be just like Ramborg if she had spoken of it to her father in spite of everything. When he came over the hill crest by the Jorengard satyr, he saw smoke and sparks going up from the roof. He thought maybe 'twas Lavrans himself that was there, and he went up to the huts. He thought he could see from the others' bearing that he had guessed right, but they sat there talking of the bad summer last year, and of when it would be likely best to move up the cattle this year, of the hunting, and of Lavrans' new hawk, which sat on the floor, flapping its wings over the pluck of the birds that were roasting on a spit over the fire. Lavrans had come up but to see to his horse shelter in Ilmansdal. Some folks from Alvdal that had come by it that day had told him it was fallen down. So passed the most of the evening. At last Simon spoke up. "I don't know if... Has Ramborg said anything to you of a matter she and I spoke of one night?" Lavrans said slowly, "Methinks it had been well you had spoken to me first, Simon. You might have known what answer you would have had of me. Yeah, I understand how it may have chanced that you named it first to the maid, and it shall make no odds. I am glad that things are so I can bestow the child in a good man's hands." After this there was not much more to be said, thought Simon. Strange enough, all the same. Here sat he who had never dreamed of making too free with an honest maid or a wife, and he was bound in honour to wed one whom he would rather not have had. But he made one trial. "Yet neither is it so, Lavrans, that I have gone wooing your daughter behind your back. I thought I was so old that she would not take it for more than brotherly kindness from old days that I spoke so much with her. And if you deem I am too old for her, I should not be surprised, nor let it part the friendship between us. Few men have I met whom I would rather have in a son's stead than you, Simon," said Lavrans, "and I would fain give Ramborg away myself. You know who will be her guardian when I am gone." It was the first time anything had been said between these two of Erland Nicolausson. "In many ways my son-in-law is a better man than I took him to be when first I knew him, but I don't know if he is the man to deal wisely with the giving of a young maid in marriage, and I see well that Ramborg herself is willing." "So she thinks now," said Simon, "but she is scarce out of her childhood. Therefore I have no wish to press the matter on you now, if you deem it should stand over yet a while." "And I," said Lavrans, frowning a little, "have no wish to force my daughter upon you. Don't you believe that?" "You must believe," said Simon quickly. "There is no maid in Norway's land that I would rather have than Ramborg." So it is, Lavrans, that I deemed it all too great good fortune for me, if I should get me so fair and young and good a bride, rich, and come on both sides of the highest kin. And you for father-in-law, he said a little sheepishly. A slight laugh came from Lavrans. Oh, you know well what I think of you, and I know you will so deal with my child and her heritage that we never shall have cause to repent this bargain, her mother and I. That will I, God and all holy men helping me, said Simon. On that they shook hands. Simon remembered the first time he had clasped hands with Lavrans on such a bargain, and his heart grew little and sore in his breast. But Ramborg was a better match than he could have looked for. There were only the two daughters to divide between them what Lavrans left, and he would be as a son to the man whom, of all men he knew, he had ever honoured and loved the most. And Ramborg was young and fresh and sweet. And surely by this time he should be a grown man with a grown man's wit. Had he been waiting here, thinking that he might wed as a widow her whom he could not win as a maid, after yon other had enjoyed her youth, and a dozen of stepsons of that breed? No, then he would be rightly served if his brothers had him adjudged incapable and set him aside from managing his own affairs. Erland would live to be as old as the hills. Such fellows as he always did. So now they were to be brothers-in-law. They had not seen each other since that night in yonder house in Oslo. Well, it must be less joyful for the other to remember than for him. He would be a good husband to Ramborg, without falsehood or guile, though it might also be said that the child had beguiled him into a snare. "You are laughing," said Lavrans. Did I laugh? 'Twas but a thought that came into my head. You must tell me what it was, Simon, so that I too may have a laugh. Simon Anderson fastened his little sharp eyes on the other. I was thinking of women. I marvel if any woman regards men's faith and men's laws as we do amongst ourselves, when she or hers can gain by setting them at naught. Halfred, my first wife, I have never told this to any Christian soul before you, Lavrans Bjorgelsen, and to none other will I ever tell it. She was so good and holy and upright a woman that I thought her like had scarce ever lived. I have told you how she took the matter of Angjerd's birth. But that time when we saw how things were with Sigrid, she would have had me hide away, my sister, and that she should feign to be with child, and should pass off Sigrid's child for hers. For thus had we had an heir, and the child had been well provided, and Sigrid could dwell with us, and need not be parted from it. I verily believe she didn't understand. It would have been treachery against her own kinsman. Lavrans said, after a pause, Then you would have kept Mandvik, Simon. Aye, Simon Dar laughed harshly, and perhaps with as good a right as many another man to the land he calls the heritage of his fathers, since we have nothing to trust to in such matters but the honour of women. Lavrans slipped the hood over his falcon's head and lifted the bird upon his wrist. This is strange talk for a man thinking of marriage, he said, low. There was something like distaste in his voice. Of your daughters, I am sure, no one thinks such things, answered Simon. Lavrans looked down at the falcon and scratched its feathers with a stick. Not of Kristin either? He asked, yet lower. No, said Simon firmly. She behaved not well towards me, but never did I find that she dealt in falsehood. She told me plainly and honestly that she had met a man whom she loved more than me. "When you gave her up so willingly," asked the father in a low voice, "was it not because you had heard some rumours about her?" "No," said Simon, as before. "I had never heard rumours about Kristin." It was fixed that the betrothal ale should be drunk that same summer, and the wedding be held after Easter the next year, when Ramborg would be full 15 years old. Kristin had not seen her home since the day she had ridden away from it as a bride. 'Twas now 8 winters since. Now she came back with great company, her husband, Margaret, 5 sons, nurse girls, handmaids, men and pack horses with baggage. Lavrans rode out to join them and met them at Dover. Kristin no longer wept so lightly as in her youth, but when she saw her father come riding to meet her, her eyes filled with tears. She stopped her horse, slipped down from the saddle, and ran to meet him. When they met, she took his hand and kissed it humbly. Lavrans leapt from his horse at once and lifted his daughter up in his arms. Then he shook hands with Erland, who had also alighted, and now came to meet his father-in-law with a reverent greeting. The next day Simon came over to Jorengard to greet his new kinsfolk. Gerd Dar and Geirmund of Kruk were with him, but their wives they had left at Formo. Simon had chosen to hold his wedding at home, so the women there were in a great bustle. As to the manner of the meeting, Simon and Erland greeted each other freely and without constraint. Simon was master of himself, and Erland was so gay and cheerful that Simon thought he must have forgotten where they had last seen each other. Then Simon gave Kristin his hand. They were less sure of themselves, and their eyes met but for an instant. Kristin thought to herself that he had fallen off greatly. In youth he had been comely enough, although even then too thick-set and short-necked. His steel-grey eyes had looked little under the full eyelids. His mouth had been too small, and the dimples in his round, boyish face too large. But he had had a fresh-hued face, and a broad, milk-white forehead beneath goodly, light-brown, curly hair. The curly hair he had still, as thick and nut-brown as before. But his face was now an even red-brown all over, wrinkled under the eyes, and with heavy cheeks and a double chin. His body, too, was grown heavy, and he had something of a paunch. He didn't look now like a man who would care to lie at night on the edge of a bed for the sake of whispering with his betrothed maid. Kristin felt pity for her young sister. She was so fresh and gracious, and so childishly joyful that she was to be wed. The very first day she had shown Kristin the chests filled with her bridal gear and Simon's betrothal gifts, and she had told how she had heard from Sigrid Undset of a gilded casket that stood in the bridal loft at Formo. There were 12 costly linen coifs in it, and they were to be a gift to her from her husband the first morning. Poor little soul! How could she understand what marriage was? 'Twas pity that she knew so little of this young sister. Ramborg had been at Huseby twice, but there she had ever been sullen and unfriendly. She could not get to like Erland, nor yet Margaret, who was of her own age. Simon thought that he had looked, perhaps hoped, that Kristin should seem somewhat worn, seeing she had had so many children. But she bloomed with youth and health, and she bore her as proudly straight as ever, and walked as graciously, though it might be she trod the earth now a little more firmly than of old. She was the comeliest mother, with her 5 fair little sons around her. She was clad in a dress of home-made rusty brown woolen cloth, with dark blue birds woven into it. He remembered standing about and leaning up against her loom while she sat weaving the very same garment. There was a little trouble when they came to sit down to table in the upper hall. Skule and Ivar began shrieking, for they were bent on sitting between their mother and their foster-mother as they were used to do. Lavrans thought it not seemly that Ramborg should sit below her sister's serving women and small children, So he bade his younger daughter sit in the high seat beside him, since she was so soon to be parted from her home. The little lads from Huseby were restless, and seemed not to know much of behaviour at the board. The meal had not gone far when the little fair-haired boy slid down under the table and came up to the wall bench beside Simon's knee. "May I look at that strange sheath you have there in your belt, kinsman Simon?" he said. He spoke slowly and gravely. It was the great silver-mounted sheath to hold a spoon and 2 knives he had caught sight of. "You may so, kinsman. What is your name, cousin?" "Count Erlandson is my name, cousin." He put down the piece of bacon he was holding on the lap of Simon's festal doublet of silver-grey Flemish cloth, drew the knife from the sheath, and looked closely at it. Then he took the knife Simon was eating with, and the spoon, and put them all in their places, so that he could see how it looked when all the things were in the sheath. He was exceeding grave and exceeding greasy on fingers and face. Simon smiled as he looked at the little face, so comely and so intent. Soon after, the 2 eldest also made their way across to the men's bench, and the twins slipped down under the table and began crawling about there under folks' feet, then out and away to the dogs by the fireplace. There was little chance for the grown-up folk to eat in peace. The children's mother and father spoke to them indeed, and bade them sit down prettily and be quiet, but the children paid no heed, and the parents on their side laughed at them the whole time, and seemed to think their ill behaviour was no great matter. Not even when Lavrans, somewhat sharply, bade one of the serving men take the dogs down into the room below, so that folks might be able to hear themselves speak in the upper hall. Ramborg left the hall with her betrothed, and went with him through the spring night a little way up between the fences. Gerd and Geirmund had ridden on ahead, and Simon stopped to say good night. He had his foot in the stirrup already, when he turned again, took her in his arms, and crushed the slender child to him so tightly that she moaned softly and happily. "God bless you, my Ramborg, so fine and fair as you are, all too fine and fair for me," he murmured into her tangled curls. Ramborg stood looking after him as he rode off in the misty moonlight. She rubbed her upper arm. He had grasped it so hard that it hurt her. Dizzy with joy, she thought, in 3 days more she would be wed to him. Lavrans stood with Kristin before the children's bed, and watched her tucking the small bodies into their places. The eldest were big boys already, with thin bodies and slender bony limbs. But the 2 little ones were plump and rosy, with creases in their flesh and dimples at the joints. A fair sight they seemed to him, lying there red and warm, their thick growing hair damp with sweat, breathing evenly in their sleep. They were healthy, comely children, but never had he seen young ones so ill brought up as these grandsons of his. 'Twas well indeed that Simon's sister and brother's wife had not been there that night. But maybe 'twas not for him to talk about breaking in children. Lavrans sighed a little and made the sign of the cross above the small heads. So Simon Anderson drank the bridal ale with Ramborg Lavransdatter, and the wedding was in all ways fair and sumptuous. Bride and bridegroom looked joyous, and many deemed that Ramborg was lovelier on her day of honour than her sister had been. Not dazzling fair like Kristin, but far gentler and more glad. All could see in the clear innocent eyes of this bride that she bore the golden crown of the house of Giesling with full honour this day. And glad and proud she sat in the armchair before her bride-bed, with hair bound up, when the guests next morning came up to greet the young folk. With laughter and free jesting they looked on, while Simon laid the housewife's headdress over his young wife's head. Shouts of greeting and the clashing of arms made the rafters ring, as Ramborg rose and took her husband's hand, upright and red-cheeked under the white coif. It was not so often that two children of great houses of the one parish were wedded. When the kindred was gone through in all its branches, the kinship would most often be found too near, so all accounted this wedding a rare and joyous festival.